Hello, everyone. I am Marissa Veely, RBA's Certification Education Director. Thank you for joining us today. For those who are not familiar with the RBA, we are the National Trade Association for retail bakers, educators, cake decorators across the country. We are so excited to be here today with Chef Susanna Schoolman of Tourlami. She is the CEO of Tourlami and founder. She's a pastry chef. She's worked for over a decade of experience working in award-winning kitchens across the country, across the world, really from Copenhagen to San Francisco. And she has founded this company with plant-based ingredients. Susanna, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and how what the inspiration was behind your company?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name is Susanna. I started this company about 4 years ago after I'd been working in the industry for over a decade. So I first started my career in New York City, where I worked at Bouchon and Lincoln Ristorante, and then I moved to San Francisco and I worked with Belinda Leong at Viva Patisserie. So I helped open up 2 locations there, and then a location in Hawaii. And then after that, I moved to Copenhagen and I helped Richard Hart and Renee Redzepi of Noma open up Hart Bakery as our head of pastry and Maserati. So I've been baking my whole career. About 7 years ago, right before I moved to Hawaii, I became fully plant-based, just kind of cold turkey, decided it was something that I wanted to do. And then suddenly my personal and professional lives were at odds. I was working with hundreds of pounds of butter every day, and then I'd go home and, not a pound of butter in sight. So I really wanted to create a plant-based pastry line, taking all the techniques that I had learned, the passion that I still had for being in the industry, and put a little bit more of myself into my work. And when I started looking at ingredients that I wanted to be using, specifically when I was looking at plant-based butters, there was nothing on the market that truly worked for professional chefs, bakers, pastry chefs in a food service setting. So that's when the idea for the company started 4 years ago, is when I officially launched my company. And I started working on plant-based butters. So we're launching next month with 2 butter recipes, Tourlami Premium and Tourlami All-Purpose. So Tourlami Premium is really your high butter fat butter. It's for laminated doughs like puff pastry, croissant, kouign-amann, laminated brioche, enriched doughs like brioche, biscuits, pie dough, shortbread, things where you want that crispness and that flakiness. And then Tourlami All-Purpose is really your bulk butter. So cookies, cakes, ganaches, frostings, fillings, sauces, compound butters, spreading on toast, putting on pancakes, really thinking about the functional uses of each of these butters and then creating exactly what we needed as chefs and people working in food service.
Fantastic. And what will you be making for us today, Susanna?
So today we're going to be making puff pastry, which I feel like is a really great, if people haven't made puff pastry before, it's a really great way, or laminating doughs in general. It's a great entry dough to start working with, specifically because it's not a yeasted dough. So it's a little bit less temperamental when you're thinking about working with the dough on the sheeter or having to proof and bake. It just becomes a little bit easier. So I wanted to start with that. Also, I think it's a great way to showcase what Tourlami can do. So we're using Tourlami Premium. And yeah, I think it's a great way to have people start putting plant-based items on their menu, but it's still really high quality, kind of classy, and tastes great.
Great. I can't wait to see what you produce.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess I'll get started. When you're looking at puff pastry dough, plant-based versus dairy-based doughs, this recipe is very similar to what you would normally use and work with. So the ingredients I have, I've scaled everything out, so it's going to be pretty kind of fast showing of how to make this dough, specifically because the thing with puff pastry is that it needs a lot of resting time. We're talking about letting it rest overnight, letting it rest at least half an hour in between folds. So I've kind of taken all the steps so that we can kind of go through it one at a time. And we're not going to be doing this for a day and a half. So the ingredients that I have are all-purpose flour and salt, cold water and vinegar, and then I have some melted premium butter. So we have 1,776 grams of all-purpose flour. I like to use Sir Galahad flour from, oh my God, why am I blanking on the name? Sir Galahad flour from King Arthur. Wow, amazing. And then the 22 grams of kosher salt. Any kind of white vinegar will do. And then the Tourlami premium butter. So it's 800 grams of cold water, 88 grams of vinegar, and 176 grams of the melted butter. So the melted butter, you want to make sure it's cool. When I'm temping the butter, I want to make sure that it's, tap water is totally fine, but I want it to, run a little bit so it is cool. I don't want the dough to heat up too much because then that will impact the mixing. But for this, I don't really temper everything. So all I do is once I melt the butter, I let it cool to room temperature, and then I'm just going to add it to my cold water and my vinegar. Just want to kind of give it a mix to make sure that it's combined. And then I'm working with a 10-quart mixer right now, so this is a pretty small batch that we're making. It's going to make 6 full sheets of puff pastry. But what I've done for this is it's going to be half sheets just so that it's a little bit easier to see. So it will make 3 full sheets of puff pastry. So we're going to add everything in. And then the salt and the flour. I just want to make sure that all the ingredients are kind of well mixed together. I don't want to have just like a pile of salt that goes right into the liquids, so I'm going to add that in. And then it's going to mix. So I have my pastry assistant here. She's going to mix the dough. So basically what we're going to do when you're mixing is that the way that I mix it, I do speed 1 for about 2 minutes, just until the dough comes together. It's still pretty shaggy. And then I mix on speed 2 for about another 3 minutes, just until the dough can get smooth. I don't want to over mix the dough. A lot of the mixing is going to happen on sheeter when we're doing our folds. So she's going to mix, excuse me, she's going to mix that. And then once it comes out, I'll show you what the dough looks like. And then you can kind of go from there. Sorry, I'm going to have some water. There's flour in here. So what I have here is the dough that I mixed yesterday. So what I did was I mixed the dough, I packed it into basically a rectangle. I wanted to make sure that the dough was as even as possible when I'm mixing it, because when you're doing any sort of lamination, it really comes down to the foundation of your layers. So if you're starting with a dough that is thicker in some parts and thinner in other parts, you're going to then see that in the lamination. So when you're starting to sheet out the dough, sheet out the butter, you want to make sure that it's as even as possible. So when I'm working with these butters, one of the interesting things about Tourlami butters is that we use cocoa butter and coconut oil as the main saturated fats. So some of the benefits of using these butters is that cocoa butter is a harder fat than dairy-based butter. So what you're going to see is that at room temperature, Tourlami premium and Tourlami all-purpose are going to be super stable. Also, when you're using the butters, because the cocoa butter is in the recipe, your pastries are going to stay crisp for longer. It will also help to stabilize if you're making lemon curds or pastry creams, stabilize these products so that you can leave them at room temperature. And the butter creams, they will not melt on you when it gets hot. They will stay stable at room temperature. So one of the things that I want to make sure of when I'm working with doughs is that the dough, even though it's been chilling overnight in the fridge, that I pulled this out maybe about 15 minutes ago just to let it start tempering. It's about 71 degrees in my kitchen right now, so it's pretty hot. So I want to make sure that the dough is obviously, doesn't get that hot, but I want it to be around 50 degrees is what I usually say is a great temperature to be locking in with. Additionally, so I have a block of butter here. This is the Tourlami premium butter that we're going to be using to make the butter blocks. You want to make sure that when you're working with this, that it is soft. I recommend that it is anywhere from like 65 to 70 degrees. And that's truly because when we're mixing, when we're laminating, this dough is gonna cool down the butter. So if you're working with the butter that's right from the refrigerator, it is going to be rock solid. So it's just gonna break into a million pieces when you're sheeting down. So it's kind of a balance. If my dough is super cold, I wanna make sure that my butter is on the warmer side of things. If my dough is around 50 degrees, I would say 65 to 70, 65 is like a great place to be. So one of the ways that you know that this butter is ready to go is truly there is no resistance when you cut through it. It's soft, it's smooth, it creates too, I mean, you can see how smooth it is when you cut into it. That's how you know that this is the right temperature to be working with the butters. Even if I temp it right now, so my butter temperature, right now it's reading 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you can see, I mean, it's not melting at all. This to me is a really great temperature to be working with the butter. So, you know, just really keep that in mind. If you work with the butter that's too cold, you're setting yourself up to fail from the very beginning. So what I do is I have my butter basically all scaled out. So I'm just gonna grab it. And then we're gonna start building our butter blocks. So the way that I do it, I have my one butter block that I made that's ready to go, so we can use that later to the bottom. But when I'm working with the butter block, I want to make sure that when I have the space, and then so the butter is about 50% of the dough. So when the dough is ready, it's going to be about 1,440 grams of total dough. Again, I work with smaller batches for myself, so that would make 2 pecans. You know, you can do 1 big pecan and then make 6 full sheets, but you know, I have a small table, a smaller sheeter, so working in larger sizes doesn't really work. So, do you have a question?
Yes, Susanna. When you're working with your butter, people are using their own formulas for, let's say, a croissant or some other laminated dough. Would you say it's essentially a 1-for-1 swap in terms of ratios?
Yeah, you know, I think that when it comes to any ingredient, it's going to take a little bit of trial and error, especially when you're bringing a new product in. You know, not all flours are 1-to-1 substitutions. You know, they have different percentages of protein in it. They're different from season to season, how long they've been sitting in silos for before they've been ground. Chocolates are different from company to company. So, you know, I think that because this product doesn't have any palm oil in it, and it sets up really quickly, you're going to want to make sure that, you know, really it's how you're working with it, and it's less a swap. However, if you feel like your pastries are getting small for whatever reason, I usually increase my hydration by about 5%. So that's usually what I do when I'm working with butters. So basically what I want to do is I make sure that my dough has been tempering. My butter is sitting out for you know, a day to 2 days, depending on how warm it is in your kitchen. And then what I want to make sure of is so this is butter that I made the butter block. And I want to make sure that when I'm cutting it into as even of a shape as possible, because eventually when I sheet it, I want to make sure that it's even. Before I guess I start on that. So the dough is ready to go. So I'll show you what it looks like when it's done mixing. So you can see here, pull this out. So the dough is pretty smooth. If I'm making puff pastry now, so I'm gonna have to pull that out in a few minutes. So what you can see is that the dough is smooth. If I pull out a little bit, it's pretty well mixed. I can get to a window. It's a little shaggy. But it's going to, as the dough relaxes and it sits overnight, the dough is going to strengthen. Also, based off of the amount of folds that you're doing, whether you're doing 4 single folds, a double fold, and then a single fold, 2 double folds, that's going to impact the amount of times you are folding and then sheeting out, which is going to keep strengthening your dough. So truly it just depends on your mixer size, how much dough you're actually mixing, how many folds you're doing. But I find that it works for me. If you feel like your dough is shrinking back a lot, it's probably because you're over mixing your dough, whether it's on the sheeter or it's in the mixer. So just something to think about. But I really just go based off of how smooth the dough is when I'm done. That's kind of the end result. So what I like to do is I'm just going to pack this up. And I want to make sure, again, that it's as close to a rectangle as I can get it, just so that it's easier to sheet down with. And then I wrap it in a little bit of plastic wrap. And then I pop that in the fridge overnight. And the dough is going to go right here. And then I'll let that cool. If you're doing 2 separate batons, you can always divide it now, or you can do it tomorrow. It really doesn't matter. So that's going to go into the fridge, and then we can go back to our butter block. So I have my butter here, which is about 50% of the dough. I want to make sure that it's an even layer as possible. Normally, I like to work with 1 silk pad and 1 sheet of parchment when I'm sheeting down. I personally just find that it's easier because when you're working with silk pads, sometimes the silk pads are kind of dark, and so you can't really see how thin you're shooting the butter out to, and so then it gets on the sheeter and it makes everything dirty. So I find that just working with 1 sheet of parchment kind of helps. So then what I want to do is I'm going to take my silk pad, and then I'm just going to kind of lightly pound the butter. The great thing about this is because you're working with room temperature butter, you don't need to put a lot of effort into making the butter block. You're going to let the sheeter do a lot of the work for you. So, I mean, it's like, I'm not putting in a lot of effort, just start pounding out the butter. What this is going to do is it's going to basically just kind of help the sheeter start smoothing out the butter, so that sometimes sheeters are not, that thick. So it's just going to get it a little bit thinner so that the sheeter can start actually rolling out. So then I flip it upside down, so then I can see exactly where my butter is. And then I'm just going to sheet this down until it gets to be, it's all by eye, truly. And once you start getting into a routine of the shapes that you're doing, basically I'm sheeting the dough down to twice the size of my butter block. And, if this is my butter block, it's roughly about like a half sheet size. If you fold it in like an eighth of a sheet pan size. So that's really what I do. I let the butter block go back and forth. And then I wait until it gets nice and smooth. So I'm going to just quickly roll this out, so you can see. So we're going to move to the sheeter right now. One of the things that I want to do is I want to make sure that the butter is just totally smooth. If I find that it gets a little jagged, I just need to kind of like spread it out a little bit more. So and I'm just going to kind of keep it out. As you can see, it just kind of went to the edge a little bit. So I'm going to, this is why I have parchment, so this technically doesn't happen. I want to make sure that I kind of unfold it on both sides, because then what that's going to allow me to do is easily trim the butter block so that I can get it into the shape that I want. So by loosening it off of both sides, the parchment side and the silk pad side, I can just truly like scrape the butter off the silk pad, and then I try and layer it out so that it's pretty well divided across the top. So once I get to this point where I feel like the butter is basically smooth on top, for the sake of, you don't want to take too much time on your butter block. You can spend hours and hours not hours, but you can spend a lot of time just really trying to make the most perfect square or rectangle. I find that it's a waste of time. What I want to make sure of is that it's 1 layer. It's roughly the shape that I want it to be. And I can do a little bit of like manual kind of like manipulation to make sure that it's smooth. So I take my bowl scraper and I just kind of want to make sure that I'm going back and forth making sure that it's one even layer. So just like how you want your dough to be the same thickness, you want to make sure that your butter is the same thickness. So, once I make sure that this is done, I'm basically going to go right into the locking in process. So I'm going to unmold this onto my sheet of parchment. I want to make sure, just because you are working with butter that's room temperature, it is going to stick a little bit on the silpat. So I'm just going to scrape that off and just put this right on top. So I just want to show the camera a little bit about how soft this butter really is. I mean, it is wobbly, and it doesn't break when you bend it. That's how soft you want to go with this. So now I'm going to grab my dough. So now we're going to start locking in. So I've had my dough. This has been sitting overnight, and I let it temper for a little bit. What I want to make sure is that this is twice the size of my butter block. So really it's just by eye. I usually go down to around 7 centimeters. I want to make sure I just hit the dough with a little bit of flour, and then I start sheeting down. So I want to try and get to the length that I want when I'm going to actually be folding the dough over the butter, and then I'm going to go for the height. And then this is when I see, like, because I cut this baton in half, it's kind of sticking a little bit on the sheeter. So I'm going to kind of try and create as rectangle of a shape as I can before passing it through one more time to make sure that I'm getting as nice of a rectangle. Because what I don't want to do, especially when I'm locking in the butter into the dough, is really having to stretch the dough to get it to that perfect shape so it folds over and you lock in the butter. What you're going to be doing there is you're essentially going to be stretching out certain places. So you're basically undoing the work that you've done by using the sheeter. The sheeter is a mechanical rolling pin. It is giving you a even thickness, and by stretching it out, you're starting to get thinner and thicker areas, which is going to ultimately impact your lamination and your layer. So I'm going to go past it through one more time. I'm going to use my butter block. If I'm ever concerned about it not being the right size, I take the butter and I'd say, okay, it could actually be a little bit thicker, and then I can make those adjustments before it goes through that last time. And then I'm going to check it out. Great. So now this roughly looks like the length that I want. I'm pretty happy with it. So I'm going to take the butter block that we just made, and then I'm just literally going to fold it right on top. So one of the things that I want to make sure of when I'm locking the butter, which I never used to do with dairy-based butter, but because this butter is so soft, I want to make sure that the dough is completely covering the butter. If you have any parts of the butter that are showing, it's going to just kind of just come right out of the dough. That's getting your sheeter dirty. It's just going to kind of be a mess. So what I like to do is I want to make sure that the top and bottom have a little bit of the dough hanging over, and then I'm just going to fold the dough over the tops. And then I'm going to just kind of lightly pinch everything together. This is when I want to make sure that I'm creating a really solid line on top when I press. And then I'm going to just kind of go through the bottom, and I'm just going to really gently press the edges of the dough together. I really don't want a ton of dough at either end because this is going to impact your lamination. But I feel like it's something that's really important to do, and I recommend you do it with any dough you're locking in because it's just going to be a mess. What this can also do is it can create some air pockets. By having dough exposed, or excuse me, having butter exposed on the top and the bottom, you're allowing air that might have gotten stuck inside the dough when you're folding the dough over the butter to escape. So I always make sure that I have like a little cake tester by me to make sure that if I see an air bubble, I just kind of can pop it. So what I want to make sure is that we've created this seam. I want to make sure that that's going in directly into the sheeter first. Otherwise, you can risk having your dough just kind of rip apart a little bit on you. So I'm going to get a little flour.
And you want to make sure that you're sheeting the dough down pretty slowly. If you start going really thick, going down really thin, you're going to risk having the dough, or excuse me, having the butter block break into different pieces. And you're just going to work the dough really quickly. So, and also on the flip side, if you go down too slowly, you're just going to be working that dough and you're going to get a really tough pastry. So what I like to try and do is get the dough to be about the width of my sheeter. And then I'll sheet down to about 7 millimeters. So because I'm doing a double fold first, I want to make sure that I have the length that I need to be able to do those 2 folds. So now I'm gonna rotate this dough again. I'm just gonna line up any edges. I see that there's a little bit of a air pocket that's forming, so I'm just gonna hit it with my cake tester.
For our friends who are used to using traditional butters, would you say that the primary difference with working with Tourlami is that sealing in of the dough block, or what would you say are the primary differences? What do people kind of anticipate in terms of working with a plant-based product?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the things. It's also the temperature. When I'm working with dairy-based butter, I don't actually want my butter to be this warm, because then you can risk having the butter work into the dough and then you're not getting any lamination. If you're making croissants or something like that, you're just going to get something that's really doughy. So I want to make sure that the butter is warm. That's something different from dairy-based butter, where you want it to be cool but not cold. And then you want to make sure that your doughs are warmer when you're working with plant-based butter, especially Tourlami, because it's going to firm up really quickly. So one of the things that I want to make sure, now that I've sheeted it down to 7 millimeters, is I want to make sure that I have an even rectangle. This is, we're going to do a little bit of my stretching. If I stretch too early in the sheeting down process, the butter isn't pliable enough, so you're just going to risk breaking it. Because this butter is pretty soft, it does have a lot of forgiveness, so you can work with it a little bit more and touch it. But you know, I'm just making sure that I'm not stretching in just one place in particular. Now I have the dough that looks pretty good. So then I basically fold it about like 1/8 of the way in, and have the left side meet the right a little bit right of center. And then I fold this over. So this is called a double fold. So basically what you're doing is you're having 4, I'll turn this over so you can see this, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of your puff pastry dough. And in each of those layers, it has a layer of dough, butter, dough. So you have 5 layers of dough and then 4 layers of butter in between all of this. This is going to help you to create a very crispy puff pastry. So then what I do is I let this chill in the refrigerator for about 30 minutes minimum. And then I'm going to take it out and then I'm going to do a single fold. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on a sheet pan. I'm going to grab my next puff, which basically has that double fold already in. And then we'll just do the next fold. Which is right down here. So
Susanna, how would you describe the flavor profile of the Tourlami product?
yeah, so it's buttery. You know, that's really the great thing about what I wanted to do. You know, I wanted to make sure that whether it's a shortbread cookie or a croissant or buttercream, you are still getting that buttery flavor. That was super important to me, in addition to the functionality of the butter and how that works. So yeah, I mean, I would say that this is probably the best tasting plant-based butter you've ever had, if I do say so myself. So yeah, so I've been letting this baton temper. So earlier today, I did a double fold, just like what we did. I let it sit in the fridge for about 30 minutes, and then I let it temper for probably like 30 minutes or so. I want to make sure that when I'm grabbing this, I can't feel any butter in any of these layers. If you can feel the butter, and if you're like, I can't feel anything, then that's, if you can't feel anything, that's what you want. If you feel like there's something that's hard, and if you kind of pinch down on it, it breaks a little bit underneath you, your butter is too cold. So again, because there isn't any yeast, you're not doing any damage by letting this dough sit out for long periods of time. If you rush this process and this butter is too cold, the piton is just going to break on you. The butter is going to break. One of the great things about Tourlami plant-based butters versus dairy-based butters is if you do break your butter piton, it's super, super forgiving. As I was recipe testing, as I was laminating, I was learning how to work, what range to work with the temperatures, with the butter. I broke the pitons all the time, and they always came out really beautifully. So if you notice that you rushed a little bit too much, it's still a little cold, you can see some cracks in the butter, it's really not going to be the end of the world. You're still going to make something that is really nice and crispy and flaky. So that's another really awesome benefit of using this butter. So now we have a double fold. I'm going to shoot it down again, and then we're going to do a single fold. When I was testing out these recipes, one of the things that I was playing around with was different folds. So I tried to do 2 double folds. I tried a double fold and then a single fold, and then I tried 4 single folds. And what I found was that this double fold and then a single fold gave me this perfect balance between tender and crispness. So when you do more single folds, you're going to get a super, super tender puff pastry. Could be great if you want to do like a hand pie or something like that. A vol au vent, something that, you don't want a million, puff pastry shards just breaking all over the place when you bite into it. And then alternatively, when you do 2 double folds, you're going to get something where the lamination is super prominent. It's going to be really, really flaky. But you have to be careful about, if you have really thick layers of butter, you could risk having the butter melt out in the oven when you're baking with it. So kind of depends on what you're looking for, and how crisp versus tender you want it to be. But I really like the double fold and then single fold. That's kind of where I find my sweet spot. So just want to make sure I have enough flour as I sheet down. Again, you can see, how soft this dough is. I see a little air pocket, so I'm just gonna get that. And I don't know if you can see it here, but what I'm looking for, when I know that the butter hasn't broken, is a even kind of like yellowy layer. If you start seeing what looks like zebra stripes a little bit throughout the butter, you've broken it. So that's something that I look for. Again, now that I've rotated it, I'm just going to take it down to 7 millimeters again. The reason why I'm going by millimeters and not like take it down to number 10, it's because all of our shooters are different. So I find that millimeters is the best way to make sure everything is consistent. Again, I'm looking to see if I need to do any adjusting, but that's the thing, especially when you're doing your first fold. I mean, truly, it goes down to when you're shooting down the dough itself before you even lock in. If you have a really even rectangle and then you have an even layer of butter, you're creating an even layer of dough, an even layer of butter, and then another even layer of dough. And then when you sheet that out, if that first kind of if that first step is even, you're going to get an even rectangle when you're doing your double fold. So the least amount that you have to kind of manipulate the dough, the better. So right now, because ultimately you don't really want to be touching doughs when you're laminating with it. So I want to make sure that it's as even as it can possibly be. So then I avoid touching it a lot when I'm working with it. So yeah, so now I'm going to do my single fold. Again, I want to make sure that if I see any air pockets, I'm just going to kind of take that out. I'm going to stretch it a little bit. just so that I can get as even a rectangle as possible. And then I'm gonna do my single fold or a book fold. So I'm making sure that I'm creating 3 even rectangles on top of itself. So the bottom layer is in line with this middle layer. And then the top layer is then in line with the middle and bottom layers. So now, again, I have an even rectangle. So I've done 3 folds, and then I'm gonna let this sit. Normally I let this sit overnight. So I do all of my, my first initial folds one day, and then I'll shoot it down the next day. So again, I'm gonna put this away. And then I'm gonna go into sheeting down to make my puff pastry half sheets. One of the things that I want to make sure of is that this dough is tempered. Because I've been letting it sit in the refrigerator all night, it's gonna probably take like an hour or so to temper. So I have the dough right here. So pull this out, you can see it. So yesterday I made 1 large baton as opposed to doing 2 smaller batons. And so what you can kind of see, I don't know if I can bring this up so that you can see it, is can you see the lamination here? So this is, kind of what I go for. I want to make sure that there is even cleanly defined layers. There aren't cracks in it. You can again see just like how soft this dough is. I can't feel the butter when I kind of squeeze it a little bit. And that's when I know that I'm ready to sheet down. So for this, I'm going down to 3 millimeters. So I want to make sure that as I'm sheeting down, especially because I have an exposed edge with a lot of butter, is that I can stick on the sheeter. So I'm just going to hit it with a lot of flour as I sheet down. Also, the thing that I want to make sure of is that when I'm looking at the length of the dough, because I'm doing half sheets, this is going to give me 3 half sheets in the baton. I want to make sure that I'm utilizing the space I have, so I don't have, like a lot of really small sheets of puff. So I'm going to set this up on the table where I have about 3 sheets just ready to go, so that when I roll the dough out, it will be ready for me. So I'm going to put that out now. I don't know if you can hear the drums in the background here, but there's a school right across from my test kitchen, and I think it's drum class. Okay, so you'll be able to see the parchment that's set up. And then, yeah, I'm going to shoot this out now. Are there any questions?
Susanna, I'm just curious. So I know a lot of people move to plant-based products for, either sustainability reasons or health reasons. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey and what brought you in that direction.
Yeah, I feel like for me personally, it was just, I've always been super sensitive to animals, and I felt like, as soon as I went plant-based, it was just the decision that felt right for me. But, like if we're looking at the global, as I started this company, I was looking at how this could impact a lot of people, and 68% of the global population is lactose intolerant. And granted, there are a lot of people in Asia, in Africa, that are lactose intolerant because butter isn't a huge part of their diet, but it impacts everybody. And one of the things that I've seen is that our menus are not representative of those statistics. So even if you're not going plant-based or putting plant-based menu items on your menu, to at least be able to offer something that's dairy-free, I think is so impactful, and you're bringing in more customers. And that was just something that I wanted to do because I'm lactose intolerant. And I don't feel like, I personally didn't want to sacrifice feeling sick in order to eat the foods that I wanted to eat. And the option was to not eat puff pastry ever again. It was just to eat something that was plant-based. So yeah, that was, one of the big reasons why I decided to do it. But yeah, so we're going to just shoot this down, hit it with a little bit more flour, especially in the exposed edge. And because this really is the length that I want from top to bottom, I'm not gonna need to turn it, but if I felt like the dough was a little bit smaller to start, I would have rotated it to get it the width that I wanted, and then rolled it, flipped it again to roll that all the way down. But because it was truly almost the size of a half sheet, I'm just kind of throwing it. So as I'm rolling the dough out, I want to make sure that I'm feeling the underside of this. Like I can feel that it's getting a little tacky here, just like you would with dairy-based puff. And I'm making sure that I'm hitting with enough flour, because as we start going lower and lower down on the sheeter, you're going to risk having the puff pastry bread. So, you know, the great thing about this butter is that the way that you use dairy-based butter, it's very similar. It's that same mindset. The things that you really need to think about are the temperatures that you're working with. But that's the pretty big difference in it. You want to use Tourlami, basically room temperature. You want your dough to be warm. But then, you know, it's still the same things. Even if I was making puff pastry with dairy-based butter, I want to make sure that I'm sheeting this out really quickly. I'm putting a lot of flour down on the sheeter. I'm being mindful of air bubbles, you know, all those things that we've been talking about today. So yeah.
When you're working with a yeast-based dough, do you have to be even more cautious about like the fermentation process, I would imagine, if you're working at room temperature, so things don't, you know, progress too quickly?
Yeah, I mean, that's especially with like yeasted products, like when I'm making croissants, I want to be really mindful of how much time it's staying at room temperature. The whole part for me, especially when making croissants, is that even if the external environment is different, so it's hotter one day, you know, the refrigerator or your freezer is not as cold as it can be, you're still keeping the dough very consistent. So when it's going through the proofing process, you know exactly how much time it needs to proof for. When it comes to that, I changed my mixing a little bit. So I mixed my croissant dough a little bit less. And then because the butter firms up when it hits that croissant dough, I'm able to do 3 single folds back to back. So I'm actually reducing the amount of time that you're taking the croissant dough in and out of the refrigerator or the freezer. I don't recommend using this butter from the freezer. Like I don't recommend you do a fold and then you put your dough in the freezer, because it's going to just set up on you and you're never going to be able to temper it. So yeah, I mean, that's a very big thing, but it's just, you know, I know some people that already do that, so they're not changing their systems at all. I find this way though, it's just less physicality when you're working. So I get to stay at the sheeter. I do one baton, I put that in, I go to the next one, as opposed to going in and out all the time. So yeah, so I want to make sure that with a little bit of flour, especially because we let it sit for a little bit. A little bit. Again, just with a little bit more flour. Then I'm going to grab my rolling pin to make sure that I'm ready. I'm going to go down to my last pass through. So I really want to make sure you can see how thin this dough is right now. So I really want to make sure that there's a lot of flour so that it doesn't get stuck when it's going through the sheeter. And coming out, I'm just going to use my rolling pin. collect the dough. Roll it up, and then I'm gonna go to the table. So right now I have 3 half sheets. So this is gonna give me more than that. So I'm just gonna show you the 3 for now, and then I can show you a little bit of the baked product, and then that'll be it. So I'm just gonna cut this right here. And then I want to make sure that I'm relaxing the dough before I do any more cuts, because what you're going to be able to see, in addition to making sure that this is great, is that this is really going to relax underneath the half sheet. Great, so then I'm just going to kind of line this up a little bit. Cut this. Ended up getting a little bit wider than I wanted, which is fine. Because this is gonna go onto a full sheet anyways. It's just easier to do half sheets for me when I'm baking it. And then yeah, that is the full process. And I can roll this out the rest of it a little bit later, but then I just want to show you kind of what the puff pastry looks like once it's been baked. So right here, there's so many things that you can do with this puff, right? So one of the things that I wanted to show was just I made some caramelized fennel puff pastry twists. You can see as I break into it, I mean, it's very flaky. I don't know if you can hear that flake. I mean, I don't know how better to show than to basically do that. You know, it really kind of just is super tender. Yeah, so that's one way, or you can bake it into full sheets. What I like to do when I'm baking with full sheets is I pull it from the refrigerator. I don't normally like to bake the dough from the freezer, so I pull it from the refrigerator, put it onto a full sheet, and let it bake so that it can rise in the oven for about 15 minutes. I pull it out, I invert it, and then I put 2 sheet pans on top. So then it kind of pushes the puff pastry down a little bit, so you get even consistent line all the way across your dough. And yeah, then you can cut it, turn it into milfoils, hand pies, you know, whatever you want. So that's the
Thank
puff.
you, Suzanne. You've showed us so much great technique for puff pastry, but also, you know, the innovation of Tourlami. Tell all of our viewers where they can find your product and how they can get more information about Tourlami, which, by the way, in the beginning I introduced, and after we had the conversation, pronounced incorrectly, Tourlami, right? So everyone knows on the call, it's Tourlami, plant-based. Plant-based butters.
Yes. Chef's Warehouse, which is really exciting. The premium butter is going to be sold in a case of 36 1-pound blocks. And then the all-purpose butter is going to be sold in a 30-pound block. So really trying to think about the ways in which you're going to use the product, make it as easy as possible. And, you know, if you have any questions, you can email me at info@tourlami.com. It's TOURLAMI.com. And yeah, I hope you can be in touch.
Fantastic. And for sure, reach out to Susanna if you have questions about her product. For more RBA events, make sure you check out our website at retailbakersofamerica.org and find out more about our virtual and in-person events. Thank you so much for being here, Susanna.
Right.
Right. Thank you so much.